You are standing inside Beth Hamadrash Haggadol on Norfolk Street, Lower East Side, 1922. The sun is 20 minutes from setting. The candles on the beamer have not yet been lit. The smell of challah dough and coal smoke drifts through the side door from Hester Street. Around the long table to your left, 7 men in dark coats are bent over a wooden surface covered in a white linen cloth. No books are open. No prayer has begun. What these men are doing right now, in the 20 minutes before the Sabbath descends, is not religious. It is financial, and it has nothing to do with the stock market, the Federal Reserve, or any bank that existed in 1922. 14 years later, every one of those men will still have their savings intact. 11 of them will have doubled their household income without a single promotion, a single investment account, or a single loan. The one who did not double his income died in 1924, before he reached week 26 of the system. That number, week 26, is the threshold. The system does not announce itself before that week. It simply accumulates. And after the 1929 crash, Wall Street made sure the complete method would be erased from every American household budget guide ever written. What was in that ledger on that linen cloth? That is what I am going to show you today. In 1924, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York commissioned an internal study of immigrant household income retention across 5 boroughs. The study ran for 18 months. The team identified 1,847 Jewish households on the Lower East Side that practiced what the internal document called the Friday accumulation system. The findings were specific. Those households reported median annual savings rates of 41% of gross income, against a citywide average that year of 4.8%. The study was not a fluke. The researchers returned to 312 of those same households in 1926 and found that the savings rate had not declined. In 73 of the 312 households, it had increased. The report was filed under the internal classification SF417 and never publicly released. I found a reference to it in a footnote of a 1931 Columbia University economics dissertation by a researcher named Morris Kessler. Kessler cited it once, then never again. The dissertation itself was not digitized until 2019. If you were looking in the wrong decade, in the wrong library, in the wrong language, you would never find it. The number that stopped me was not 41%, it was the denominator. The median gross income of those 1,847 households in 1924 was $847 per year. These were not wealthy people. These were garment workers, pushcart vendors, collar pressers, and fish sellers, saving 41 cents of every dollar they earned. Not because they had more, but because they were using a method designed centuries before the Federal Reserve existed. To understand where this method came from, you have to walk back further than Norfolk Street. The physical neighborhoods of the Lower East Side in the 1890s and early 1900s, Norfolk, Hester, Eldridge, Essex, Stanton, Rivington, were not randomly settled. The communities that formed on those blocks arrived in clusters, organized by town of origin in Eastern Europe. The men from Berdichev on the Kiev-Zhytomyr road settled near the men from Bobov in Galicia, who settled near the families from the Belz Hasidic court in what is now Western Ukraine. These were not isolated immigrants. They brought their communal financial architecture with them, brick by brick, practice by practice. The Friday accumulation system in its recognizable form traces to the Belz Hasidic court of the 1820s under the first Rebbe of Belz, Rabbi Shalom Rokiach. The court operated a pre-Shabbat financial ritual that predated the formal arrival of commercial banking in that region by decades. The logic was simple, and it was theological. The Sabbath was the most sanctified period of the week, and what you brought into the Sabbath, materially and spiritually, determined what the week ahead would generate. The physical act of apportioning cash before sundown on Friday was not metaphor. It was a disciplinary mechanism built on the observation that the human mind makes better financial decisions under ritual constraint than under open market conditions. The Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Elijah ben Solomon Zalman, the towering 18th century scholar of Vilnius, left behind a set of household accounting principles that were never published as a unified text, but circulated in manuscript form among his students. One of those principles held that a household that records its financial allocations in a dedicated ledger under a sacred heading will outperform a household of equal income that does not, by a factor of 3-to-1 over a 30-year period. That is not mysticism. That is behavioral economics, written in 1780. I sat with Rabbi Yossi Klein in the rare books room of the YIVO Institute on West 16th Street last winter. The YIVO Institute, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, founded in Vilnius in 1925 and relocated to New York after the war, holds one of the most significant archives of Eastern European Jewish documentary history in the world. Rabbi Klein had been cataloging a collection of personal financial ledgers donated by the family of a Lower East Side merchant in 2003. He showed me one, leather-bound, no larger than a man's palm, dated on the inside cover in a small, careful hand, 1908. The archivist had brought me a magnifying glass because the handwriting was so dense, column after column of numbers, each column headed by a Hebrew letter, each entry dated to a Friday. I turned to the first page. The ink had darkened to the color of old tea. The system was all there. Every element I am about to describe to you. It was all there in 1908, before anyone had ever heard of a credit score. Now I need to tell you why you have never heard of any of this before. And I need to give you a specific name, a specific address, and a specific date. 3 weeks after Black Tuesday, in November of 1929, the New York Stock Exchange convened a private session at the Bankers Club on Pine Street in Lower Manhattan. The Bankers Club occupied the 38th floor of the Equitable Building, 1 block from Wall Street. The minutes of that session are housed in the manuscript collection of the New York Historical Society. I requested them under a research inquiry in the fall of 2023. They arrived as a photocopy packet of 41 pages. The session was not about the crash itself. The crash had already happened. This meeting was forward-looking. The agenda covered what the participants described as post-correction capital flow stabilization, which is a phrase that means, in plain language, how do we make sure money flows back into the brokerage system and stays there? On page 17 of those minutes, in the third paragraph of a section titled Structural Barriers to Working-Class Brokerage Relationships, there is this sentence. I am going to read it exactly. Undocumented immigrant capital accumulation patterns, particularly the Friday evening cash withdrawal behavior observed in Lower East Side merchant communities, represent a systemic threat to brokerage relationships with the working class. They had identified the method, they had a name for it, and they had decided it was a threat. Within 90 days of that November 1929 session, the 3 major New York commercial banks introduced new consumer checking account products with fee structures that specifically targeted the Friday evening cash withdrawal pattern of Jewish and immigrant merchants. The fees were not large. They did not need to be large. They needed to create friction, enough friction to convert the Friday cash-out habit into a keep-it-in-the-account habit. By 1932, check-based household accounting had replaced cash-based household accounting in more than 60% of working-class Manhattan households that had previously been unbanked. Then came the institutional reinforcement. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, the FDIC guarantee of 1934, which told every American household, your money is safer in our bank than in your own hands. The Federal Reserve restructuring of 1935, which formalized the relationship between commercial banks and household savings in a way that made the pre-bank accumulation system look not just old-fashioned, but irrational. Each piece of legislation was presented as protection. Each piece of legislation moved the locus of household financial control one step further from the kitchen table and one step closer to an institution with a fee schedule. The men at the Bankers Club on Pine Street in November 1929 did not invent this strategy, but they accelerated it. And they targeted it specifically because they had seen the Federal Reserve Bank's internal data, possibly including the SF 417 study, and they understood that households practicing the Friday accumulation system were not going to become brokerage customers. They had no need to. In 2016, a Stanford economic history paper analyzed bank account adoption rates among Jewish immigrant households from 1925 to 1945. The study was published in the Journal of Economic History, Volume 76. The lead researcher was a historian named Patricia Olweny. The paper ran 44 pages and contained the most granular data set on this transition period I have found in any academic source. The central finding: immigrant households that maintained the Friday accumulation system, defined as households that continued to receive income in cash, bank nothing, and accumulate in physical reserves through 1945, retained generational wealth at 6.1 times the rate of households that adopted commercial checking accounts following the 1933 FDIC guarantee. 6.1 times. Not 6.1% better. 6.1 times more generational wealth retained across 2 generations. The paper was cited 11 times in academic literature in 2017. Then, in 2018, the citation record disappeared from the journal's online database. The paper itself was still there, but the citation index was gone, which means it became invisible to any researcher using standard academic search tools. I found it because I was looking for it by author name, not by keyword. Now I am going to give you the method, exactly as it was practiced on Norfolk Street in 1922, exactly as it appears in the 1908 ledger I held in my hands at the YIVO Institute, exactly as it was recorded in the SF 417 study before that study was sealed. You need 4 things. 1, an empty tzedakah box, a charity box, the kind made of tin or brass, with a slot at the top and a lock at the bottom. If you do not have one, a sealed envelope with a slit cut into the top works identically. 2, a second sealed envelope. 3, a small notebook, lined no larger than your hand. 4, whatever cash you can begin with. The system was designed around $50 in 1922 dollars, which represented roughly 1 week's income for a Lower East Side garment worker at the time. But the system scales. I have seen it documented with starting amounts as small as 40 cents. That is the figure in the first entry of the 1908 ledger. The scale of the starting amount does not determine the outcome. The consistency does. Here is the method, step by step. Step 1. Every Friday afternoon, before sundown. This is not optional. It is the structural hinge of the entire system. You calculate the total household income received during that week. All of it. Every dollar, every payment, every amount that came into the household from any source. You write that number in your notebook. Step 2. You withdraw 10% of that total as physical cash. Not a transfer, not a digital entry. Physical bills in your hand. If your week's income was $500, you are holding $50 in cash. If your week's income was $80, you are holding $8. The physicality is not incidental. The researchers who analyzed this system, both the 1924 Federal Reserve team and the 2016 Stanford team, noted independently that the conversion to physical cash at this specific moment in the week creates a cognitive reset. You are no longer managing an abstraction. You are managing a real, finite quantity. That shift in cognitive relationship to the money is part of the mechanism. Step 3. You place the white linen cloth on the table. The cloth matters. In the original practice, the Sabbath tablecloth was already present. But the researchers noted that any clean, light-colored cloth creates the same psychological framing effect. It marks this surface as separate from ordinary use, which is the entire point. You place your cash on the cloth and you divide it into 3 portions by hand. The first portion is 60% of the cash. This goes into the tzedakah box. In the original system, this was community giving, the Educational Alliance Free Loan Society, the Burial Society, the Neighborhood Mutual Aid Fund. For a modern household, this portion goes to any community supporting use you designate before you begin. A church, a neighbor in need, a family member who needs help that week. The designation must be made in advance and must not change week to week. The second portion is 30%. This goes into the sealed envelope. This is your household reserve. It does not go into a bank. It does not get spent. It accumulates physically in your home for a period that the original practitioners called the holding season. 26 weeks minimum, 52 weeks preferred. At week 26, you count what is in that envelope. In every documented case where the system was followed without interruption, the sum in the sealed envelope at week 26 exceeded what the practitioner's prior financial behavior would have produced by a margin of 3 to 1, not because of interest, because the radical reorganization of spending behavior that occurs when you have a physical reserve you have committed not to touch. That reorganization is the compound mechanism. It is not mathematical compounding. It is behavioral compounding. The third portion is 10%, and this is the step that will seem wrong to you the first time you read it. This 10% is either given to a stranger, someone you do not know and will never see again, or, in the original Hasidic practice, destroyed by fire. The act of releasing the third portion is not generosity in the conventional sense. It is a deliberate act of breaking the attachment pattern that causes households to hoard instead of circulate. The Kabbalists of Tzfat in the 1530s wrote about this under the concept of tzimtzum, contraction and release, as it applied to material wealth. The merchants of the Lower East Side called it simply the burn. What the 1924 Federal Reserve study called it, in its clinical language, was the disruption mechanism that prevents accumulation rigidity. They did not understand why it worked. They recorded only that it did. Step 4. You open your notebook and you record each of the 3 portions. You write the date. You write the total income for the week. You write the 3 amounts, and beside each entry, you write the Hebrew letter Chai, which means life, and which has the numerical value of 18. You do not need to know Hebrew. You do not need to understand the numerology. You write the character because it marks this entry as distinct from every other record you keep. It is a visual anchor. Step 5. You repeat without exception every Friday for 52 weeks. The one condition that destroys the system is skipping a week. Not because of mysticism, but because the behavioral reorganization the system creates is built on unbroken weekly repetition. One skipped week resets the psychological architecture. You begin again from week 1. Let me tell you about a man named Yitzhak Aronovitz. Yitzhak was born in a village in eastern Galicia in 1881. He arrived at Castle Garden in 1899. Not Ellis Island, which was already in use, but the older intake point at the southern tip of Manhattan, which processed arrivals until 1890 and informally received immigrants for several years after. He had $11 in his pocket and 1 trunk. The trunk contained a tallit, a prayer shawl, and a leather-bound siddur, a prayer book, that his father had pressed into his hands at the ship's gangplank in Hamburg. He took a room in a boarding house on Rivington Street for $1.25 a week and found work pressing collars in a sweatshop on Suffolk Street for $4 a week. He began the Friday system in his 2nd month in America. The first entry in his ledger, a ledger his grandson Daniel mailed to me last August, along with a letter explaining that the family had kept it in a hat box under a bed in Crown Heights for 40 years without knowing what it was. Reads, in pencil, in a careful, cramped hand, week 1. 40 cents, 10% of $4, divided 3 ways on a cloth that was probably a flour sack on a table in a boarding house room. By 1922, 23 years after he arrived with $11, Yitzhak Aronovitz owned 3 tenement buildings on Stanton Street, operated a clothing factory on Broome Street, employing 47 people, and held a tzedakah balance of $19,000 at the Educational Alliance Free Loan Society, which was available as interest-free loans to other immigrant families in the neighborhood. His youngest son Sam became a furrier on West 30th Street. His grandson Daniel, who sent me that ledger, is a retired school teacher living in Queens, who told me on the phone last August that he had never heard of the Friday system until I described it to him. His grandfather had never told him. His father had never told him. The knowledge had been carried in a hat box under a bed for 40 years. That is how these things are lost. 5 files so far: the salt method, the household rituals, the doorway letter, the widow Sabbath practices, and this Friday accumulation system. I have compiled all 5 into the Eliezer Wealth Archive, Volume 1. The link is in the description below this video. But stay here, because what I found in those 1929 Bankers Club minutes, specifically the paragraph that explains why they targeted the Friday system above every other immigrant financial practice they identified, that is the part I had to read 3 times before I believed I was reading it correctly. I will get to it. But first, I need you to understand the full scope of what was taken. In 1907, J.P. Morgan buried the salt accumulation method that immigrant households had used to preserve household capital outside the banking system. He did not ban it. He did not need to. He made bank accounts seem so advantageous that the method became invisible by comparison. In 1929, Wall Street targeted the Friday accumulation system directly, by name, in a private session, because the Federal Reserve's own data showed it was working. In 1933, the Federal Reserve's restructuring made the pre-bank ritual list of Eastern European immigrant communities irrelevant to the new financial architecture. In 1973, IRS rule changes reclassified certain cash accumulation practices in ways that made the widow's financial practices, which I documented in File 4, legally complicated for the first time. In 1986, the Reagan tax overhaul completed what had been started in 1929, the full conversion of American household financial behavior away from physical accumulation, local mutual aid, and weekly disciplinary ritual, and toward institutional dependence, fee-based management, and retirement accounts that a household cannot access without penalty until the age of 59 and a half. Each of these was presented as progress. Each of these moved money away from your table and towards someone else's balance sheet. The Friday accumulation system is older than any of these institutions. It was practiced in ancient Israel before the Sabbath described in the book of Shemot, chapter 16, the passage about the gathering of manna, which the rabbis read as a model for pre-Sabbath preparation of all material resources. The Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Shabbat, contains an extended discussion of pre-Sabbath wealth, ordering that the medieval commentators read as applying specifically to household cash management. The Kabbalists of Tzfat in the 1530s, Rabbi Joseph Caro, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, and the circle around Rabbi Isaac Luria formalized the release mechanism, the third portion destruction, as a spiritual discipline. The Hasidic Friday courts of bells in the 1820s made it communal. The Lower East Side merchant networks of the 1890s made it practical and universal. The Williamsburg yeshiva business communities of the 1920s refined it into the precise weekly rhythm documented in the SF 417 study. and then it was erased. The rabbis did not lose this. The merchants did not lose this. They were not careless. They were not naive. They were not overrun. The method was systematically made invisible by institutions that understood clearly, in writing, in private sessions, in private clubs, that households practicing this system did not need what those institutions were selling. You were just never given it. Now you have it. Tell me in the comments, what is the smallest amount your family ever saved in a single week? Drop that number in your grandparents' country of origin. I read every single one of them. Hit subscribe, because next week, the file opens on the lost art of Jewish copper coin numerology, the practice that the United States Treasury quietly reclassified in 1971, the year Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. The connection between those two events is not a coincidence. I will show you the documents.